In this session, we're going to discuss the Bristol sessions that Ralph Peer conducted in Bristol, Tennessee, where basically modern country begins with the Carter family and Jimmy Rodgers. In the last session, we saw some earlier country artists like Fiddlin' John Carson, the Hillbillies, the Skillet Lickers, and we saw the very beginnings of what's called hillbilly music. But this is really a a way out of that sort of early eclecticism where country music is beginning to be shaped with certain, let's say, mythic or narrative impetuses behind it, ways of looking at what country music represents, of how it deals with tradition, and how it deals with the representation of the self and the family and values and so on. Now, let's talk a little bit more about Ralph Peer. He's shown up to us several times. Remember that in 1920 he's at OK Records and he records Crazy Blues. He's an assistant engineer at that point with Mamie Smith. And he devised the term race records, emphasized the idea of turning to unexploited markets. At first, the black market, and then later poor white Southerners. In 1923, as we saw last time, he had a portable recording studio set up at Nassau Street in Atlanta, and he recorded Fiddlin' John Carson, and this is the beginning of country music, what was then called hillbilly music. And he recognizes that people weren't really seeking out traditional music. This idea that country music is a combination of mass art and tradition is very important, right? They're not just seeking out traditional music. They want, as he wrote, something new built along traditional lines. Something that they recognize that's building on tradition, but it's still got to be something new. In other words, it's still mass art. It's still this emphasis on the new. So there's still commercial records caught up in consumer capitalism with its concern with the eternally new, and yet there has to be a veneer of the traditional. So, for instance, we talked about the Skillet Lickers, and we talked about for their version of Soldier's Joy, where they start off by acting like you're at a traditional dance in someone's house, where you're pushing aside the good rug so that people can dance and not ruin your rug. Of course, this isn't what's actually happening. They're in a studio in New York when they're recording that. And it's also not what they expect is happening when you're listening to it, that they're giving rise to a representation of this thing, an idealization of this thing. So Ralph Peer realizes that a lot of this has to do with image. It has to do with ways of working the industry. And that's what he's really a genius at, as we're about to see. By 1926, he's the general sales manager of OK Records. But he leaves to go to Victor Records. Now, Victor refused to match his salary at OK, which was about $16,000 a year, roughly equivalent to $200,000 a year now. And they said, well, we can't. You're one of many managers here. You're not running the whole thing like you were basically doing at OK as the general sales manager. And he says, okay. So he says, I'll work for you for nothing. You'll just give me $1 a year, but I get control of the mechanical reproduction rights, which he would then split with the artists. Victor thought he was insane. You have to understand that this is still pretty early in the whole notion of mechanical reproduction rights. So this is a fairly new source of income, and Victor had no idea how much money was at stake. In fact, Victor was terrible at keeping records of that stuff because they didn't really pursue it. It was 2 cents per record sold. And that seems like nothing, 2 cents, right? But remember that this is a guy who realized that he could sell a record like at OK when he sold Crazy Blues, 750,000 copies in a month, right? 2 cents on that is a decent amount of money. You're talking about what, $14,000 in a month. And keep in mind that his entire salary was $16,000. So 2 cents adds up fast if you keep track of it. And of course, he was going to do that. It made him phenomenally rich. And Victor thought they were getting away with murder here. They thought they were ripping him off, but he earned millions. Now, of course, you have to make sure the records sell well, and for that you need stars. So he can't just have these anonymous traditional performers. He needs to build up real star power on both the race record side of things and on the country music or hillbilly side of things. And John Carson's just not going to do it. So Victor is very good at promoting stars in classical music, for instance, Enrico Caruso. Remember all those Red Label recordings? But nobody really tried to do that with popular music. The idea with popular music was that it was so ephemeral, there really wouldn't be any stars. So what Pierre does is he goes to Bristol looking for stars. And Bristol is a good spot to do that in, as we'll see. Ernest Stoneman, who is sort of has an ancillary connection to the Hillbillies, and so he's already met Ralph Peer, and he becomes Ralph Peer's country music advisor, basically. And Stoneman thought that Witter, we talked about him last time, was entirely mediocre. And so he becomes Ralph Peer's Victor Records talent hound. He's going to seek out good musical talent on the country music side of things. And this leads to the 25th of July through the 5th of August, 1927, Bristol sessions. And Bristol's important because it's right there on the border of Tennessee. And what it does is it brings in people from all over that region. These Appalachian musicians, these musicians from West Virginia, musicians from Virginia, musicians from Tennessee. And it's here that Pierre discovers both the Carter family and Jimmy Rodgers. And really, they represent the two streams, if you will, of that beginning of modern country, coming out of that really early period. He places ads in the local papers, and he attracts numerous acts, including the first recording sessions for what turned out to be the two biggest country stars of early music. So on he starts releasing these right away. Remember, he's recording these in the summer of 27, and by November 4th of 27, he's already releasing the Carter family's Poor Orphan Child and The Wandering Boy, which winds up being a very successful recording for them. And then he's also releasing recordings by Jimmy Rodgers. So you have these two different paths forward, basically, that we'll see. You have Jimmy Rodgers. Jimmy Rodgers is obviously a solo artist. He's singing and accompanying himself on guitar, and we'll see some more details about his approach to performance in a moment. But the Carter family, they're obviously a family act, and so you have these two different visions of what country music represents and how it goes about representing that. Let's take a look. Jimmy Rodgers is famous for his yodel. He's known as the singing brakeman. He used to work for the railroad for a while, and the blue yodeler. The blue part is coming from the fact that he's singing and yodeling with some elements of blues language, the flat third, and so on. He had a reputation for being a wanderer, hopping railroads. When he wasn't working, he was also, just sort of bumming rides on railroads. His first recordings for Pierre included The Soldier's Sweetheart and Sleep, Baby, Sleep, and they were moderately successful. They weren't huge. He then travels to New York City to record more with Pierre and to, use better equipment to bring him into an actual studio. They actually recorded in Camden, New Jersey. Camden had a lot of early recording studios left over from Edison in those early days. And this session included the song Blue Yodel. And that one sold really well. It sold 500,000 in 2 years, and it became a sensation. And so this wound up being a sort of calling card for Jimmy Rodgers. He has a whole slew of songs called Blue Yodels, and they're just Blue Yodel number 2, Blue Yodel number 3, and so on. And there are several of them. There's a Blue Yodel that he records, as we'll see, with Louis Armstrong. There's so sometimes he's doing them with other artists. A lot of times they're just him. And basically the format of the song is he's singing. Usually it is in a blues form, right, with the AAB lyric and the 12 bars. But then he yodels in the midst of it. He therefore embodies the kind of slightly dangerous but alluring rough male image. This guy that comes into town, has no permanent address, maybe he drinks too much, maybe he gambles a bit. He's charming, but he's not the marrying type, that kind of thing. And he embodies that in a series of these short films. He makes several short films in the late 20s and early 30s that are basically just like music videos, more or less. And we'll see how that develops over the course of the 30s and 40s. Notice when you listen to him, notice the very loose rhythmic delivery of his yodels and the equally loose sense of phrase and meter. So he sort of, the phrase chunks into groups of 4 when he's singing, but when he's when he's playing guitar, he tends to cut measures here and there, so a very loose rhythmic feel. He sometimes simply adds extra beats or measures when he's getting ready to sing the next line. So there's a lot of vamping in his music as he's trying to think of the next line. He just sort of vamps, and he doesn't always do that in a regular way because after all, he's not playing with a band. He whenever he's ready to go, that's when he goes. So very similar to a country blues artist in that sense. And this lends the recordings a sense of informality without disrupting the overall sense of structure, right? So you have this sense of how the blues works, but just like in the country blues artist, there's a kind of freedom involved there. The other side of things, so if Jimmy Rodgers is the kind of gallivanting solo artist, the more traditional down home family group is represented by the Carter family. They're led by A.P. Carter. He's the group leader and he's the bass voice. But he's very inconsistent, as he says. When you listen to these recordings, you'll hear he basses in once in a while, and what that basically means is he'll sing when he feels like singing, and then he goes over to the window and stares out the window smoking a cigarette while the two women in the group really do most of the work. So the main singer is Sarah Carter, and she's the lead singer. She has this very recognizable alto voice, very husky voice. Sometimes people think she's a man when they're not used to listening to this. It has a kind of hill Appalachian quality to it. This kind of it's an interesting voice because on the one hand, it connects with the more traditional folk-like vocal production that we'll talk about later. But on the other hand, there's something engaging about it, and she's clearly very talented and very smooth in her approach to singing in other ways. So you have this way in which it's commercial and a way in which it connotes more traditional elements. Then you have Maybelle Carter, who really should be considered, there ought to be a guitar hero game for her because she's really an innovative guitarist, and it's easy to forget that. She sings she sings backing vocals and plays guitar. We'll talk about the innovation in a moment. So they're very immersed in mountain gospel music, and their harmonies come out of that tradition along with shape note singing, which was a way of getting these tight harmonies without necessarily being highly musically literate. And they represent the wholesome image of country music. So this is, in fact, they even advertised their performances as good, clean entertainment, right? And they were against drinking, and you know, obviously AP and Sarah were married. They wound up having serious marital issues and got divorced, which helped bring about the end of their career. But at first they came across as being very emblematic of the traditional family. Now Mabel's guitar style, as I said, was highly innovative. She alternated a slightly syncopated version of the melody with bass notes with strums of the chords, and this is what's sometimes called the Carter scratch. It becomes the foundation of the country and bluegrass approach to guitar, but at the time it's really just her own idiosyncratic approach, and you'll hear it on pretty much any of their songs. You will hear the melody in the lower strings of the guitar, and then she's strumming in between. Now it's sometimes hard to tell what's her strumming and what's Sarah strumming the auto harp, but you'll eventually get used to that sound. And it's a really interesting way of approaching the guitar where you are your own accompaniment in a sense. And so there's always the melody in these songs is always playing. If they're not singing it, then she's playing it on the guitar. The approach is sometimes different, and that's what leads to the variety in these songs. And I'll talk about this more in a podcast episode. Now, the Carters also, just like we saw with Jimmy Rodgers, they add or subtract beats and measures in certain parts of the tunes, particularly transitions from verses to choruses or from choruses to guitar statements. But here it feels a little less like a nod toward informality and more of a structural decision. After all, there are three of them. Right, or at least two of them. At least in some cases, it feels like a structural decision. There are times where I imagine Maybelle, when she's playing her own solo, probably just nods and people know how to come back in. But there are times where it's very clearly a structural decision because all three of them are singing together. So they must have known that they were going to sing a measure of 3/4 in the midst of an overall 4/4, because it couldn't have been improvised. They're singing together, they're staying together. There's no hiccups involved, right? And again, I'm going to talk about some of these examples in the podcast episode and play them for you. or at least play my version of them for you. They had major hits with songs like "Keep on the Sunny Side," "Wildwood Flower," which I'll play in the episode, "Can the Circle Be Unbroken," which I'll also play, and "Wabash Cannonball," which becomes a hit many times over. It's a sort of country staple. In 1938 through 39, they moved to Del Rio, Texas, because what they were doing is they were performing twice daily on a border radio station, and that's what you see there, XERA, in Villa Acuña, Mexico. So they're going across the border every day to perform twice on Mexican radio. Why? Because the U.S. started to have more and more restrictions on radio and how loud you could broadcast. The reason being, of course, that they didn't want radio stations bleeding into each other. If you had a powerful enough transmitter, then, and let's say that you're in New York, and there's another radio station in Ohio, and the Ohio station is right next to you on the dial, and they're blasting at a very high voltage, then they're going to interfere with and sometimes even just disrupt entirely your broadcast. So the U.S. wanted to keep that from happening as much as possible. Well, Mexico didn't have those restrictions. So border radio becomes a huge deal where you can just amp up the wattage as much as you want. And people could hear the Carter family all throughout the South broadcasting from Mexico because the station was so powerful. Locals said that the station was so powerful that when they were transmitting, their teeth would ache, that they would actually feel the transmissions. I don't know if that's true, but that's what they said. They break up in 1944, in part because the marriage between AP and Sarah Carter were failing. But Maybelle continues to perform with her daughters, and known as the Carter sisters, and sometimes they would perform as the Carter family still. But this is, of course, a different group of family members. In 1949, they're joined by the guitarist Chet Atkins for a year, and we're going to talk about him more soon in an upcoming episode. Most of the 1920s witnessed an economic boom. This was an era of great technological advances, some of which we've been talking about, the phonograph and the radio, for instance. But General Electric made huge advances in their business and profit that year. You have, of course, all the various radio networks. It was just most of the 20s was a huge business opportunity for a lot of people. And so investing in businesses became a major way in which several people from the middle class and upper classes helped to make their money. That people were becoming true capitalists in the sense that they're providing money to businesses and getting returns. Now, one of the things that creates a problem with that, of course, is what that leads to is what's called an economic bubble. And an economic bubble, put in the very simplest of terms, simply means that the way the stock market works in general is you're not really buying stock based on what the business is currently doing. That's part of what's involved, but really what you're doing is you're investing in what the business can do, what it's projected to do. And so whenever you have an economic boom like that, in like the 1920s, then the onus on the businesses really is to continue to not only make money but to continue to grow, and usually to grow at a fairly outlandish rate. And so the futures, the betting on the future, which is in essence what you're doing when you're buying stock, it gets a little out of control. And there's also the problem of the way that the gold reserves work internationally at this time. And so there are a number of ways in which the income through stocks was too much. And it had strained the economy. Now, there were several economists of the time that thought that that kind of growth was just going to go on forever, that it was a kind of continuing growth model. And we still, by the way, often look at economics this way. We know better than to believe that that's actually true, and yet part of investing in stock markets is this belief in kind of an eternal growth. Well, that's exactly what happens with the stock market over the course of the 1920s. That all of that technological advance, all of that money that was being made, has people buying on margin. They're buying into these ventures. They're not paying as much as they are going to owe if it fails, because they're hoping to get a return on that investment. And for a long time, that is what happens. But then we get to 1929. And in 1929, there's the stock market crash, of course. Um, Basically, what happens, and again, I'm putting this in fairly simple terms, which are the only terms that I really understand at all. Uh, that economic bubble bursts. People realized, or the market realized, or the people who were observing the market realized, that many of these businesses could not produce the amount of new income that they were promising to produce, and so those futures come into question. One of the things that happens the day of the market crash is there's so much selling going on that it overwhelms the ticker tape machines, right? So the way that people knew how much a certain stock was worth is that you had these constant printouts as long as Wall Street was open. Well, it gets overwhelmed by the amount of people selling at this point. And whenever you have a lack of information, people panic. So there are runs on the bank. There's more and more people trying to sell off stocks that they think are crumbling. And this leads to basically a disaster, right? Because the banks, they don't usually have as much money as on hand as the people have invested in the bank, because they're investing in various stocks as well. And so when the stock market crashed, that affected the banks. The banks have runs on them as far as people trying to get their money out of it because they're panicking and they want their money, and perhaps they've just lost money in the stock market. And it creates this chain reaction. Already by 1933, by 4 years after, the economy's starting to recover, just not very quickly. And we'll see that President Roosevelt puts in place various economic plans, various work project efforts, and so on, works projects, in order to get the economy to recuperate. But those 4 years, or 3.5 years or whatever, are pretty devastating in a number of ways. And the hits keep coming, as we'll see, over the course of the 30s. So even though the economy starts to recover by 33, it's a slow crawl out of that hole. And it doesn't help that right in the middle of the 1930s, you have the Dust Bowl phenomenon. This is another one of those just terrible mistakes that people have made in the area of Oklahoma and parts of Texas, and that whole middle spot in the lower middle United States. That's an area where the soil isn't terribly secure. And now if you farm it correctly, if you put the right kind of crops in and you keep the rotations the right way, you can keep the soil more or less firm and moist and so on. But if you don't, it's very much given to wind erosion. And what wind erosion does is it piles up, basically. And so the reason it's called a dust bowl is because it reaches a sort of critical mass. And here you can see, this is a picture of the area where you can see this dust storm coming through. The wind has blown up all the dust from these various farms that haven't been tended to properly. And again, the farmers aren't exactly to blame. They were working with the knowledge they had. Sometimes they knew that there was a problem, but they didn't believe it would be as bad as it was. And you can see it was quite bad. And what it does is the dust clouds really wiped out the agricultural area, so that it became impossible for a while to grow anything in that area. And so you have another mass migration. Those of you who've read The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, that's about the reactions to the Dust Bowl. The rise of a renewed interest in folk music, especially political folk music of the Depression era, is partly owing to the Okies, the people who had to migrate out of Oklahoma and other areas where the Dust Bowl occurred, or where it was, however you want to think of it. And so this was a devastating hit against a part of the country that was thought to be relatively stable. There was already some instability with wheat prices and so on. That, in other words, the 1930s did not start well for the United States. The stock market crash in October of 29 basically announced that the 30s were going to be a very rough period for the U.S. Hoover, the President Hoover, who actually foresaw what was happening here and foresaw that the stock market could crash and was trying to warn people against it. No one was listening to him. He actually had a lot of the right solutions, but people didn't pay attention, in the stock market crashed, and he had a hard time getting the other members of government to help him pull things out. And of course, he couldn't get. Toward the end, he couldn't get any help from the other side politically, the Democrats, because Roosevelt, of course, was getting ready to run and didn't want Hoover to have any kind of credit for pulling the people out of the Depression. So it was just a mess. And then Roosevelt comes into office in 33 and starts to improve things through various economic programs that we'll talk about down the line. But like I said, it was a slow climb out of the abyss. So one of the ways in which country music gets through the 1930s is through the brother duets. This is a very typical form of musical expression throughout the 1930s, and there are several important ones. Often it's a guitar and then some other instrument. Sometimes it's a smaller, like an alto guitar. Sometimes it's a mandolin, as you see here. And so this is the Monroe brothers, and they're one of the most important of the brother duets. And they play a mixture of traditional folkish music and then religious music. Some of their best songs are their religious releases. And what they do is they sing in very tight, usually some very interesting harmonies. And you have just the two performers, both on string instruments. And that way it's pretty inexpensive for them to tour. A lot of times they get radio shows. So the Monroe brothers were on the radio and had a radio show. A lot of the brother duets that we're about to look at had radio shows or were regular guests on other radio shows. And these were fairly inexpensive groups to tour and to record, and so this is a main way in which country music maintains itself throughout the 1930s. Let's look at a few other examples. Here's the Louvin brothers. They're a little more, as you can see from the get-ups, they're a little more on the pop side of things, a little less traditional country. They're kind of the model for the Everly Brothers and for the kind of 60s popish country, country and rock and roll mixes that you see in the 50s and mid-50s and the early 60s. Let's look at the next one. Here are the Blue Sky Boys. The Blue Sky Boys were another guitar and mandolin group. Really gorgeous harmonies. Their version of Karina Karina is one of the great, I think, moments in 1930s country music recordings. They were a much more polished group than some of the others, but they still had ties. Unlike the Louvin brothers, they still had pretty close ties to traditional country. So they're a kind of model for the way that the folk music revival in the 50s will go. The Blue Sky Boys are an important part of that. Let's look at one more. This is probably my favorite of the brother duos. You can see here it's a guitar and a slide guitar instead of guitar and mandolin. And this is the Dixon Brothers, and they're much more closely related to the sort of rough-hewn traditional country approach, where the singing is very nasally. They have a song called Weave Room Blues, so they're talking about issues in the Depression, issues in the Industrial Revolution. They have another song called Intoxicated Rat, which is sort of a fun song about this rat that you're trying to catch, and it drinks up all your whiskey and so on, whatever. And so it's sort of this contest between the man and the rat, and it's meant to be a humorous song, but their harmonies are so interesting. There's a lot of dissonance, a lot of the way that they tune even their consonant intervals makes them a little harsher than you hear in other groups, and so they're definitely worth checking out. So that's it for this session. Listen to the podcasts that go along with it, and I will see you at the next session.